There's a lot of stigma around HIV and STDs in different communities, especially smaller communities. Um, I have cases where I have gotten people that turn out positive. I have one client. She came out HIV positive, actually full blown AIDS, very sick. And I was instructed as a case manager to take her to the emergency room. Um, she was completely dehydrated and had lost over 100 pounds and in a period of 3 months. So when I took her to the hospital, um, I was absolutely disgusted with the service she was given. Although I was there and I kept advocating and talking to the intake person, I said, please refer to her as a woman. She identifies as one. She said, legally, I cannot. It is against the law for me to call this person a woman when she's actually a man. And her records have a male name, and there's no way I'm going to do that. And that was just at the intake. And instead of taking her into the emergency room, they sent her back to urgent care. And I'm not a doctor, but honestly, she needed an IV and needed help. And they didn't give her any kind of emotional support. And that provides a really scary place for people to go to. More often than not, in the transgender community, especially monolingual speaking, she only speaks Spanish. She was afraid to find out her status. She was afraid to go to the emergency room. She was afraid of the medical industry. How would she be accepted? And her fears came to materialize when she went for care. In the urgent care clinic, it was the same thing. And I literally got on my knees and I asked this woman, can you please have some respect and identify her as a woman? And it might seem dramatic, but my client was crying and I felt helpless. And I think that's one of the biggest barriers to care for us in HIV and STDs. How are we going to be treated? Fortunately, when we got in to see the doctor, he had come in from Los Angeles and he had a large caseload of transgender people, so he was very respectful of her. But this was a county facility, and that's really scary for a public health department to endorse this kind of behavior.
In my opinion, HIV and STDs continue to disproportionately affect the trans community for a number of reasons. And I do have to clarify that statement in that my opinion is that HIV disproportionately affects a community of trans people, a subset of trans people, primarily trans women of color are who are being affected by HIV. I think that STDs is a more general, occurrence in all trans people for a number of reasons. One of them is that we are attractive people, and people want to have sex with us, and so that is one of the reasons why we're subject to HIV and STDs. I think another reason, particularly around HIV, is that lots of trans women are economically disadvantaged, and as a result of the economic disadvantage, turn to behavior that A, provides them with perhaps a means of income, and B, provides them also with a sense of being valued as women, and C also provides them with access to a network of other people who are like-minded and who kind of, support that lifestyle. But I think that it really, falls back on the economic disadvantage and the bias.
Well, I think that first of all, I think the tie in I think that the HIV incidence rate amongst the sex workers inflates the rate among the transgender population in general, and that's because of the just the sheer number of transgender sex workers that there are. And that brings into the greater problems of poverty and low educational attainment and discrimination based on employment. Those are the real root causes of a lot of the problems. You know, not having access to jobs, not being. I think employment discrimination is probably the biggest factor affecting transgender folks now, is not being able to get good jobs to get better care, not being able to get jobs so they can afford their housing, so they're not forced into do side work, whether sex work, whether sex work is their primary source of income or a supplement. They're still forced to do it because we can't get the good jobs to pay for our housing, pay for our lifestyles. We can't, medical insurance doesn't cover a lot of stuff, so we can't afford to pay for it. So we have to do sex work, and that like I said, and then with so many people in that field, there's always going to be clients and Johns from personal experience that will offer you more money to do it without protection. So people who are hard up will do it. I think that a lot of ways that that transgender people get validation of their gender identity is through sex and through sexual encounters. So I think that leads a lot more transgender people into doing higher risk behaviors or more lower risk behaviors along the way, which could cause the disparity in the HIV rates. That's something that's something I can the seeking validation through sexual encounters. It was a very, very big thing for me when I was younger. It still kind of is, and it still kind of is the way I feel like I get validated by my gender identities, by how I'm treated in sexual encounters. And that's definitely a subject that's not talked about a lot in the greater scheme of the community.
Certain communities of trans women are actually at a very high risk for HIV transmission and have a very high prevalence of HIV in their community. And those tend to be, in California at least, it tend to be poor women of color. And I think that part of that is related to their sex work, but not directly. What most studies have shown in major cities is that transgender women who are poor, or even if they're not, have a difficulty getting jobs. They can't get traditional employment. So they end up turning to sex work. They're also at greater risk for losing their families, being kicked out of their homes at a young age. So you have a group of people who don't have access to usual employment, who end up turning to sex work. It's almost like a family tradition. They find an older trans woman, takes them in, leads them to their new profession. And what we find is that people say that their sex work leads to drug use, which then leads to an additional risk for HIV transmission. And you end up with this cycle of people having incredibly low self-esteem because they're excluded from society. They're working in a job that's not respected, where they have to compromise themselves in many ways, and it leads to a cycle of low self-esteem. That low self-esteem, I think, leads to a cycle of people being willing to take more risks.
Yeah, social factors, of course, weigh in. Like I've said before, there's a lot of discrimination and stigma about trans people, and for us to get legitimate work is pretty hard to do if we don't pass. I think it's easier for us if we pass as male or female.
And also there's such pressure to pass and to be more feminine that people will do other things to try to change their bodies. They'll buy hormones off the street, but most risky is their use of injectable silicone. And it's often not silicone. Sometimes people will try to sell them injections of motor oil, of antifreeze, of old cooking oil. And this puts people at incredibly high risk because they're basically not using clean procedures. So they're sharing needles among their clients. And these women are taking this risk merely to look more beautiful, to look more female.
So the transgender community is at high risk for HIV, specifically male to female. I don't think there have been enough studies done for female to male side, but what I see is a lot of sex work happening. Part of my process was to affirm my gender identity, and inadvertently somehow I got involved in sex work, and that really was an ego booster. Although it was a false sense of security and acceptance in this world, it did provide me with a quick fix, so to speak. And I think that a lot of the community has a hard time finding work, legitimate work, due to discrimination. So unfortunately, that leads to us having to support ourselves and just finding any way to do that. So sex work seems to be the most devastating trend in the transgender community right now. And that puts us at very high risk for HIV. A lot of people in the Latino community don't believe in condom use and actually pay more to be able to have sex with girls without condoms. And when someone wants to go and have sex reassignment surgery, for example, and they don't have a way to raise money for that, their answer is usually going to be yes. And I have a very high percentage of positive clients that I serve here because of that, and also injection drug users. Now, I'm using that term loosely because here there's a large trend, and throughout California, I think it's global really, but there are silicone parties, and girls are getting pumped to get fuller lips, to get the anatomy that they see themselves as internally. And insurance doesn't cover surgery or augmentations or whatever. And it's seen as elective surgery. And for most of us, it's a life or death thing. So these girls are going to people that say they're medical professionals but really aren't. And they're getting injected with foreign substances. And sometimes these substances are injected with shared needles. And that's another risk for HIV. Blood to blood, of course. And so there's a lot more than that, but that's like a sneak preview of the high risk.
Are there greater risks for trans people for contracting sexually transmitted infections and or HIV? You know, it's complicated. I think that a lot of people that are marginalized tend to have issues with self-esteem, and certainly not all trans people or marginalized people, but if the society's constantly telling that you're weird or not good enough or there's something wrong with you, it's really, really hard not to internalize that. And I think sometimes for young people who are just coming into their sexuality, that can cause you to take some bigger risks as far as exposing yourself to sexually transmitted infections. So depending on how you're doing as a trans person, how kind the world has been to you or how brutalized you've been, I think you can fall into a higher risk category for sexually transmitted infections. There's definitely a culture of sex work for young male to female clients. I think some of that is because there's not a lot of other options open to young MTFs, especially if they don't pass well. And oftentimes they've been very brutalized in this culture, and they're very marginalized and very just on the edge financially, emotionally, self-esteem wise, and there does unfortunately tend to be a risk of these young people putting themselves in danger of contracting HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. I don't see that so much in female to male transgender people, and I think that has to do, and this is just my theory, is that if you're going from a gender that is generally put down in this culture to a gender that's more empowered, you're going from female to male, you tend to take that empowerment with you. The female to male clients that we see tend to be better educated, have more opportunities, tend to be of ethnicities that are not as marginalized as our clients that are male to female. So I have to say that it's not the fact of being transgender, but how the society treats certain transgender people that does put them at higher risk for sexually transmitted infection.
Transgender people are at risk for HIV or other sexually transmitted diseases based on their behavior, not based on their identity. And so their risk factors are generally the same as for anyone else based on their risk. The only difference is you have to think about some of the mechanical issues that are somewhat different, or also some of the cultural and educational issues. For transgender men, female to male, many transgender men came of age in the dyke community. They were otherwise identified as lesbians, who are generally not a community that concerns themselves a lot with protecting themselves from sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV. So trans men tend to be very laissez-faire about their sexual encounters. And also, once a trans man takes testosterone, there's this incredible surge in libido that can cause them to put themselves at risk purely by means of their increased desire and the kinds of risks that they're willing to take to satisfy that, which may or may not be conscious to them because they really are not coming from a place of having to worry about that. Also, I think a lot of trans men end up having sexual encounters with men where even when they were not previously attracted to men or never anticipated that they would be sexually attracted to men, they end up having sex with gay men. For trans women, there's a myth in the community that if you've had sex reassignment surgery, that you're less at risk for HIV and sexually transmitted diseases because your vaginal lining is skin, because if you have a penile inversion method, when the reality is that you're actually at greater risk because this is skin that isn't self-lubricating, and so it's easy to get micro-tearing, and so it actually places them at somewhat greater risk if they have unprotected sex. So a lot of it is really about education and myth, and we have a lot of education about what to do with our biologically female and male parts, but we don't have any education that's widespread around how we use our body parts in ways, even if we're a trans man who has a vagina and has penetrative sex, no one's ever educated that person on how to actually protect that vagina, how to protect the parts that they're using, that they may be using in completely different ways or identifying in different ways. So we really have never developed good educational materials. We actually don't have a really good understanding of the risks. And it's a community that is not easy to find, and so it's a harder community to reach.
Well, in terms of sexual practices,